Hello and welcome. My name is Andy and you're watching ModTop. This is a very special episode for many reasons. In this video I will show you how I built a F-104G Starfighter for the German Federal Air Force, and I almost failed. In fact, I even failed several times, but more on that later. This is the first aircraft model that I have ever built in 25 years. As a child, I glued a lot of airplanes together and painted them with a brush using Humbrol and Revell enamel paints. But since then, I've stuck with military vehicles and figures. This project came about because a good friend of mine got the pilot equipment of a former Starfighter pilot, and he wanted to put a small model next to it in his display case. The specifications I was given were that the model should be not larger than 1:72 and it should fly, so it should be presented on a pedestal or flight base and not on its landing gear like most aircraft models. It was also supposed to be an aircraft from Jagdgeschwader 71 Richthofen, from which the real pilot suit came. And then I really wanted to get it finished before his birthday so I could give it to him. So I looked for which model I could build, and I found two available Starfighter models that I could buy. Once a model from Revell and then an unsigned kit from Academy. I wanted to build the Revell model, but since it doesn't contain any matching decals, I also bought the Academy kit because it at least provides the decals for German starfighters from the 1960s that I needed. Sampling the aircraft begins with the cockpit, but since the thing was supposed to fly, I wanted a pilot in the cockpit. I had to search for quite a while before I found anything suitable as an STL file for 3D printing. Unfortunately, the figure was intended for a very large scale, and some areas were so thin that they couldn't be printed at all in 1:72 scale. So I had to recreate or to sculpt a few areas of the figure with modeling putty. I painted the pilot in the usual flying outfit of the time, with olive green pressure compensation pants, a dark gray leather jacket, and a white helmet. The cockpit area became a light gray color, and the Martin Baker ejection seat was primarily black with a bit of bronze green. The ejecting loops were black and yellow. After the basic colors, I threaded the entire cockpit with black acrylic wash to create some contrast. The pilot was also threaded with an acrylic wash, and later I painted a few squadron insignias on his sleeves. The Revell kit included decals for all the cockpit consoles, which I was happy to use. The whole cockpit looked okay to me. The fuselage halves could then be closed and glued together. Unfortunately, it turned out that a lot of filling and sanding work was necessary. The radar nose was significantly larger in diameter than the aircraft fuselage, and the entire landing gear flaps couldn't simply be glued closed without some gaps having to be closed. So this aircraft is clearly intended to be built with the landing gear down. However, I would like to skip the talk about all the improvements to the Revell kit because they ultimately no longer played a role, because I made a real stupid mistake. Apparently, I didn't test the cockpit hood when fitting the pilot figure. Yes, and unfortunately, it didn't fit anymore. So the pilot was glued well, but I couldn't get it out. And I couldn't just cut off the head either. But I saw the transparent parts were made very thick, so I had the idea of simply sanding and polishing them a little thinner And because I only needed less than a millimeter, and due to the strong curvature, I had to cut the clear parts in order to be able to sand in the middle of the pulpit. And since I still couldn't get to the spot where I wanted to go with a file and sandpaper, I just used my Dremel tool. Yes, this was my next stupid mistake. So this worked wonderfully first, until the edges were so thin that they simply became soft at some point, and yeah, they melted away. Now I had a Starfighter model that I had spent hours and hours filling and sanding, and for which I no longer had a cockpit canopy. I turned my entire spare part boxes upside down and unfortunately couldn't find anything suitable. The Academy hood didn't fit either because this model had a completely different fuselage cross-section. So what should I do? Order another Revell kit and do all the work again? No. So I just started gluing the Academy kit together. It was still there anyway, so why shouldn't I try this one? So I started gluing the fuel tanks together as described in the instructions. Then came the hull. The advantage of this kit was that the fuselage only consists of two halves, so the nose and some transitions definitely fit together. Unfortunately, no real cockpit was included. The academic kit is from 1963, yes. And back then it was apparently enough to include something like a very bad pilot seat and an even worse pilot's figure. That was absolute crap. When I was about to start planning to build a cockpit from scratch, I remembered that I already had a Starfighter cockpit that I could use. After some back and forth, I decided to cut up the Revell model and use the usable parts of it. So I took the saw and I started cutting heavily. That went quite well too. The Academy hull also needed some adjustment. I cut out the strange cast-on ejection seat parts, and then I freed the already finished Revell cockpit from the remaining fuselage parts. In the front area, the Academy hulls had to be trimmed a little again, and step by step I was able to adapt the two fuselage halves with the Revell cockpit. A new wall had to be put in behind the pilot seat, and a little bit of putty was also needed in the area of the instrument panel to close the gaps, but the whole surgery worked surprisingly well. I was able to glue the two fuselage halves together again. Then I painted the remaining cockpit areas and I retouched some areas with new paint. Also glued the visor from the Revell model, and finally I was able to glue on a cockpit hood. Unfortunately, all the attachments to the fuselage fit just as well as the Revell model did, so I had a lot of sanding and filling to do again. The area around the landing gear flaps was very bad. This model was apparently not intended to be built with the landing gear retracted. The fuel tanks also needed a bit of filler, and after all the sanding I had to re-engrave some panel lines or recut them with a razor saw, and to have at least some details on the fuselage. Then the wings could finally be glued on. Unfortunately, these do not have a specified position, so you have to determine the exact position of the wings using photos. I aligned them using tape before finally gluing them on. I also attached the pylons with the wings. Instead of the fragile plastic pitot tube, I made one myself out of metal. To do this, I used two hollow needles with different diameters, which I glued together with superglue. This decision really made sense, as I would definitely have broken the plastic part several times during further construction, and the metal parts were surprisingly resilient. Before starting painting, I also dried a hole in the fuselage where the stand would later be attached. And after that came something that, to be honest, I was really afraid of. As I said at the very beginning, I'm not an aircraft modeler, and the airplanes I built in my youth were simply painted with a brush. So I've never masked a cockpit canopy before. In fact, I've only masked anything off once or twice in the last few years. I can remember some markings on a tank where when I removed the masking tape, the paint underneath was also removed. So I really had very little experience, and if I had it, it was a bad experience. Nevertheless, I found the masking work on the cockpit very relaxing. And since there was no layer of paint underneath, I couldn't remove anything. And what was supposed to happen? If some paint actually runs under the masking, it can definitely be removed with a toothpick or something like this. And when I remove the painted struts, I would simply paint them again with a brush. To make sure that the primer sticks really well on the aircraft, I rubbed the entire model with isopropanol to remove all the fingerprints and sanding dust. And previously, I pushed a holder made of a piece of welding wire into the tail of the aircraft so that I no longer had to touch it. The whole model was then given a primer coat in the lightest primer I had. There were a few places that I had to sand down again after this, and the result is certainly not perfect, but at some point it has to be good. And then the masking continued. The outer fuel tanks should have the neon orange signal surfaces, so I wanted to keep the almost white primer in those areas. To make sure that when I removed the masking tape, no underlying layers of paint came off, I first stuck all the adhesive tape I used onto my cutting base, and I then removed it from there. So the adhesive strength is still very good, but somewhat reduced. It also calmed me down a little and made me feel better doing it this way. Then the first actual color was used. All undersides were given a layer of Hataka RAL 9006, just like the real Starfighters in the Norm 62 painting scheme. Then I masked off all of the light gray undersides and I sprayed on the next color, which was Hataka RAL 7012. Unfortunately, the geometry of the Starfighter model does not fit 100%. So actually the dividing line between the top and bottom of the colors should line up exactly with the tip of the side air inlets. But these air inlets run slightly upwards on the model. So if I had used this as a dividing line, the paint would not run to the nose of the aircraft, but would end somewhere with the cockpit. So I ran the dividing line from the wingtip to the nose of the aircraft. Next, Hataka RAL 6014 was used. So the tops of all additional tanks were also sprayed with this. And at this point, I was surprised at myself because, I have to say that I found the whole masking process more relaxing than annoying. Yes, really. And after all the masking and gradual painting, the moment of truth came. Of course, I really wanted to see what the result was. So I removed the masking very carefully and tape piece by tape piece, and there was no peeling of any underlying paint anywhere, and all edges were more or less clean and straight, and finally a real sense of achievement after all the previous chaos. But the next little setback came straight away. Because of the euphoria, I immediately took off the cockpit mask. And it would have made more sense to leave them on until after the final coat of clear coat. So the two other additional tanks received their warning paint in the orange paint in RAL 2005, and here too I was satisfied with the result. Now there were still a few small parts to paint. I sprayed the aircraft nose in FS16473. This is a light gray, or better dark egg blue, and this seems wrong at first glance because this color looks almost white in several photos, but when you look at really close-up photos, you can see very clearly that this is the right color. I painted the turbine outlet with a gunmetal gray using just a brush, and at the very end it was dry brushed with silver. The air inlets were painted black, and here you can see what I mentioned earlier with the wrong dividing line of the camouflage colors. On the real aircraft, the dividing line was exactly in the middle of the air inlets, and on the model I have to let it run further down, otherwise nothing would really fit together. I also masked the glare protection in front of the cockpit and painted it with dark green. That was FS104G, and then the model was given a coat of glossy varnish. I then darkened the recesses with mixed enamel wash, dark brown for green vehicles. And after drying, I removed the excess wash with a paper towel and a cotton swab, like usual. Yeah, and then the decals were used. The decals of the Revell kit were very good, but they were intended for a later camouflage painting and would have been wrong on my 1960s Starfighter. So the Academy decals match the time frame, but are intended for a naval aviator or Marineflieger. But I needed badges for a Starfighter from the Luftwaffe Jagdgeschwader 71. So the existing registration number of the kit is 23 plus 25. And fortunately, a plane with the registration number 23 plus 52, so 25, 52, flew with Jagdgeschwader 71, so bingo. I just had to swap the last two numbers and leave out the Navy-specific insignia. All I was missing was a squadron emblem, and I looked for such a badge on the internet, and I found one, and edited one to fit. Then I printed it out with a laser printer in the required size on white decal paper, and finally all I had to do was cut it out exactly along the edges, and I had all the badges, all the decals I needed. Also, I applied the Academy decals over a layer of glossy varnish with microset and then treated them several times with microsole. They did not become transparent in all areas. As a precaution, I cut out the large decals pretty precisely anyway, but unfortunately the small maintenance instructions are showing silvering in some places. I then painted some of the particularly bad areas with a base color with a brush. I also treated some other parts of the plane this way, so because the original airplanes were anything but perfectly painted. As you can clearly see from contemporary color photos, the machines were often left outdoors, and the paint was somewhat faded or dirty in many places. In order to represent these weathering effects a little better, on the one hand, I didn't want to overdo it, but on the other hand, I wanted to create an interesting, somewhat patchy surface. I decided to use oil paints. So little by little, I tried to emphasize some panel lines better, to make individual areas fade a little, and to make others look slightly different with a little yellow or greenish or bluish hue. So the good thing about oil paints is that if you don't like them, you can completely remove them with thinner. Oh yes, and before using the oil paints, I gave the model a coat with matte varnish. Personally, I think that oil paints work better on a matte surface, and I find it much more difficult to blend the colors on smooth, shiny surfaces. Even though this blending of oil colors is a lot of fun, at some point I had to stop myself. I didn't want to portray a gate guard, but rather an active combat aircraft. So sometimes less is more. No, I was finally able to align in and glue the beautiful, colorful fuel tanks, and I think the machine definitely looks great with them. Then she got another layer of matte varnish, and then I was almost finished. In addition, I had ordered a painted stone base with a hole that I wanted to use as a flight base. And since the hole in the base was too big, I made a plastic sleeve with my FDM printer, in which I could attach a metal rod. I also designed and 3D printed a small name plaquette, and which I still have to clean, paint, and attach. And here's the whole thing is finally finished. First the flight stand. And here is a finished plane. Unfortunately, the model has a few quirks. Some areas are not sanded as smooth and perfectly as I would have liked. Few sanding particles somehow made it into the cockpit, and you can see a bit of silvering on some of the decals. Yeah, and added to this are the shortcomings of the Academy kit itself. All in all, it was a trip far outside my comfort zone and with a lot of new experiences. And yet I draw a positive conclusion. I learned a lot for myself. Above all the masking work was completely new to me, and I think it worked all really well. I need some distance from airplanes for now, but I can definitely imagine putting another airplane on the workbench again at some point. But hopefully a better kit without all the unnecessary filling and sanding work. I hope you had some fun watching it, even if it wasn't a real tutorial. It sometimes helps me to see when things aren't going perfectly for others, and my building can certainly be used as such a negative example. If you liked it, please do all the YouTube things. So like and subscribe. That really helps me a lot with channel development. And otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and hopefully see you soon.